have to write something for your people? Some kind of an evaluation of you? I have a keeper. It's in my pocket. Do I have an... Okay. Good morning, Hillel. How are you? Morning, Rob. Morning, Rob. How are you? Good morning, Ricky. How are you? You warm? It's going to be very warm in here. Okay, good morning, everyone. Shabbat Shalom. Happy New Year. Shabbat Shalom. Happy New Year. You'll be proud to learn that the heating system in this room was repaired, sort of temporarily. So they told me not to play with the thermostats. So I don't know what I'm going to play with. It's going to be hard. Good morning. Hope everybody's well. Happy, healthy New Year to everyone. I hope it's been a good New Year already. It's a good beginning. Following our Torah study, we're glad everybody's here. Following our Torah study this morning, you're all invited down to Sher Lapati. It's just a lovely service this morning, a quiet service. There's no simchas we're celebrating. The playground minion is meeting as well. Come on in, come on in. And after shul, there'll be Torah study, Parsha study in the Lieberman Zicklin Youth Lounge. This week, we sort of begin all over again. All the projects and classes of the synagogue schools open up. So this week, on Wednesday night, we'll commence with the second semester of the College of Jewish Studies. This year, our Wednesday night lecture series is devoted to the question of personal theology. What does it mean to believe in God? Who is the God you believe in? How do you come to that belief? And we've met some wonderful, wonderful teachers. Our first teacher who will be coming, come in. The first teacher who will be coming on Wednesday night is Professor Daniel Matt. Danny Matt teaches at Graduate Theological Union in Berkeley and has spent the last 10 years of his life engaged in a process of translating the great text of Jewish mysticism, the Zohar. So he is really the world's leading expert in Jewish mysticism and Kabbalah. And he'll talk to us about the God we meet in mysticism, the God we meet in the Zohar and in Kabbalah. He's a wonderful teacher and a lovely, lovely soul. So please join us Wednesday night for that, okay? Sorry? Yeah, everything's recorded. And this one, they're going to try to live stream again. They had some problems with the system, but this one should be live streamed. So join us Wednesday night for that conversation. On Friday night, Rimonim, which is our musical Friday night service. It begins at 6:30. Unless you want to nosh, come earlier. And it's a lovely service to join. On Shabbat, on Saturday, Torah study we'll have in the morning. And our guest speaker that morning will join us is Rabbi Jonathan Slater, who's one of the directors and teachers for the Institute of Jewish Spirituality. Johnny's a scholar of Hasidic tradition, and will bring us texts from the Hasidic tradition that reflect on the Torah portion. And so we'll have a conversation we'll have Torah study, and Johnny will help teach it. Then there'll be shul, the Neshama Minyan, the wonderful musical women's minyan that men are invited to, will be next Saturday morning, and everyone is invited to that as well. Let me see. And then on the two other announcements. On the 18th, which is a Friday night, I think, Shabbat Shira, the Sabbath we celebrate Jewish music, we'll be welcoming a wonderful Israeli musical group, Navat Tehillah. We sing a lot of their songs, and they're coming. They're going to be doing a whole weekend here. But Friday night, a beautiful musical service with this wonderful group. So please come and join us for that. And then on the weekend of February the 9th, 8th and 9th. 8th and 9th, the Neshama Minyan is going away for their retreat. So all the women of the community are invited to go to Brandeis Bardin for a quiet weekend of prayer and learning and being together and celebrating and dancing on February 8th and 9th. And all the gentlemen, we will have men's time together with our children, right? Yeah, with our remote controls. Yeah. So whatever you do. So please, those who'd like to join that retreat, Nina's still looking for people to come and join. And it'll be very, very nice. I think that's all the announcements, unless I forgot anything. Did I forget anything? If I did, I apologize. Lunch and Learn will begin not this week, but next week. So, okay, we are in the beginning of the book of Shemot. So, there is a set of television commercials which I've been watching. I'm sure you watch television and you see these commercials. One is for this Ancestry.com. And the others for 23andMe. It turns out, and the doctors in the room can help us understand this, that apparently they have now refined the genetics of ethnic identity. So that you send them a drop of your blood or something, and they send you back a profile, a pie chart of what you are. So your ethnic identity. So there's two commercials, one with a gentleman who says, "We were always German. We had German lederhosen and we danced in a German troupe, and I sent my blood away and it came back and it turns out I'm not German at all. I'm Scottish, so I traded my lederhosen for a kilt and a bagpipe." And then there's another one that I just saw the other night where it's a woman this time and she says, "We're Italian. We ate Italian, we talked Italian, we felt Italian, and I discovered I'm only like 1/99th Italian. I'm actually Eastern European." I mean, screaming at the television, "You're Jewish, lady," you know. You know. Eastern European, yeah, sure, you know. So the first thing is, it's an astonishing to me. I mean, I don't know about you, but because having grown up in a Jewish home, my grandparents are immigrants, like we knew who we were because we know what village we came from, and the idea that a person could not know who. Like, how was it that you thought you were German and discovered you didn't ask your grandmother where she came from? I mean, I guess not. But what's really interesting is that this is so popular because Americans are so invested in trying to figure out who I am. I don't want to be just part of the faceless crowd of anonymous Americans. I want to be somebody, and part of it is I want to know where I came from. Right? You know.
I did this. I act Betty and I did this.
So what are you, German, Italian?
I'm descended from Elizabeth Warren.
I know.
Who knew? I thought it was Scottish.
Who knew? It's gonna.
I said to Betty, I'm going to get me a beer and I'll...
No, it's going to challenge your politics there. It's amazing. I mean, so what do you? I mean, you know, most Americans are mutts. I mean, you know, I'm Scottish, Italian, and and terrier. You know, some sort of, I'm half Great Dane, half Dachshund or something. You know, it's just an interesting thing. So the point of this is, and it's where we start the Torah portion this last week and this week. And for the next few weeks, is that an origin story is really a story about identity. It's not the story of where I come from is a question of who I am, and it's a question of what's expected of me. So the name of the book we're reading is called Shemot. Now, names in the Bible are arbitrary; they come from the first significant word in the Parsha, but you can see that. What this is really dealing with is this question of identity. Who am I? Where did I come from? Where I came from is indicative of who am I. And what's important about this, of course, we've talked about this before, and the American identity story, the American origin story, is the Thanksgiving story. We all came from someplace else. And we all fled tyranny. And we all came seeking freedom. And we all made terrible sacrifices and took terrible risks to get here. And when we arrived here, we discovered a welcome and a providential kind of bounty and blessing, and for that we give gratitude. That's the Thanksgiving story. And the overlay of the Thanksgiving story, which is the overlay of the biblical story, because that's where they got it from, was that they called themselves pilgrims. They didn't call themselves immigrants or refugees or aliens or tourists. They called themselves pilgrims. Now, pilgrim is a religiously loaded word. It means you're going from a place of lesser sanctity to a place of greater sanctity. A pilgrimage is a journey to get close to God. And if you call yourself a pilgrim, then what you understand is that your journey to this place has something to do with encountering sanctity, encountering the sacred, encountering God. It's not simply my own whim or my own need or an opportunistic journey. It's a journey to encounter the sacred, which is a very important piece of American identity. Americans have this idea in the 18th century and the 19th century, this idea of manifest destiny. And in the 20th century, this idea that we are here to do God's work. One nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. We are here to defend divine values, and we are aided by God, and God is on our side.
Except the under God was added during the communist era.
Yeah, no, I know that, but
it should have never been a religious nation in the first place. The whole point was...
No, that's the point. No, see, that's where you're wrong. Under God was added in the 1950s. You're correct, but it has always been a religious nation. We've never had an established church the way England or France does, but what I'm trying to suggest is that there is an element of religiosity that has always adhered, has always been part of the American story, right? And some people interpret that as a Christian religiosity. There are some people who do that, but there's always been this idea. That's what pilgrims are, right? If they weren't pilgrims, they were refugees. But that's a whole different story, right? So there always has been a religious sense, which is either sometimes very inspiring and sometimes can be very corrupting. Because if you believe that you are God's instrument, then everything you do is right, right? And then you can, and you tend to have big blind spots, right?
It was made on a Thursday, knowing that that was not a religious day for anybody. It was supposed to be a non-religious holiday.
And it gives you a shopping day on Friday, too, which is also religious. That's the other part of American character. You have this one day of gratitude where we have enough and we give thanks to God, and the other day we all go chop whatever we can find, you know. It's a terrible... I mean, Black Friday is like the worst way to end Thanksgiving, you know. Okay? So this is this is an origin story, is a story about identity. The story we're reading in the Torah is about identity. It's about who we are. In fact, that question is going to be asked in a number of ways quite explicitly through the text. Who are you? Who is this people, right? Pharaoh is going to say to Moses, who is this God? And Moses is going to say to God, who am I? And they're all trying to figure out who they are in the course of this transaction. So let's go back for a moment to the beginning of this and take a look at it in those terms. And then we'll jump into today's Torah portion, which is the second one in this series of 4. So we're going to start with Shemot on page 317, right? Anyone have a chumash? Not have a chumash? You need chumashim? Yeah. We need chumashim? Who can I send to go? Doug, you want to go for some chumashim? Steal a few from the shul? Thank you. Here, leave us the microphone. I won't ask any questions. Okay. Okay, ready? Ve'ela shmot b'nei Yisrael by Mitzrayim et Yaakov. And then it starts out, this is the recapping from the previous story. At 317. These are the names of the children of Jacob who came from Canaan down, and it gives you the names of all of the children. Vayamat Yosef v'kol echad v'kol adorahu b'nei Yisrael paru v'yishritzu. Okay, this is just a prelude. This is the end of the Genesis story. So the family in Genesis, it's about the family, and the family comes down. Now, the first thing about that is all of those names will later become names of tribes. So the first statement of identity is what holds us together is that we have an ethnic connection, a familial connection, a blood connection. Because one of the questions that this is asking is, what's our identity as a collective? What do we owe to each other? What do we owe to each other? Okay? What binds us together? What gathers us together? If you want to think about this in a setting, think about where that question would become a real question. Right? One, I've told you, in the scholarly thesis of how the Torah was put together, we end up in exile after 586 BCE. We sit by the waters of Babylon, and there we weep, and there we cry, and there we remember Zion. But there we make certain steps in order to hold the community together. So you have a community of Jews living in exile, far away from their land, their temple having been destroyed, their king having been humiliated. So they're no longer a political entity. And they're living in the waters of Babylon. They no longer have a land. All of the signs and symbols of our collective identity are gone. We have no institutions. We have no land. We have no political status. So the question is, what are we and what are we to each other? And that this community, thank you, Doug. Thanks so much. Thanks. Thank you. The great question of what are we and what are we to each other? And the story, the Torah is put together out of the documents that they brought with them, partly in answer to that question. Everybody good? Now, what happens if you are a political community defined by your land, defined by your government, defined by the institutions that represent your collectivity, and all of those are taken away from you? No land, no government, no institutions of collectivity. Do we have an identity? I mean, the reason why the Babylonians brought us to Babylon was because the theory is that if you separated a people from its land, separated a people from its institutions, separated a people from its leaders, it would disappear. Having no symbols of its collectivity, they will simply assimilate into the cosmopolitan populace of the imperial capital. That's the theory. That's what happened to the 10 northern tribes. They were taken away to Assyria, and they disappeared. They didn't end up in Utah. They were taken away to Assyria, and they disappeared because they had no land. They're living in a country where no one speaks the language. They have no leaders. They have no institutions. You assimilate into the populace. But here, you have a group of people, and they're sitting by the waters of Babylon, and they're crying for Zion. And they made a very interesting decision. We're going to stay together as a community. Now, how are we going to do that? Well, we're going to have to redefine our identity, because you can't define it as citizens of Judea. There's no such thing as Judea. We can't define it as residents of a place. We don't live in that place. We can't define it as loyal subjects of a king. He's gone. What are we? And that's the question that's being asked here. That's what's being debated. What are we? And what you have out of this process, I'll give you the end of the story, is an ingenious invention of a new identity for this people. An identity that enables us to survive 1,800 years of diaspora. I mean, think about this. There's no reason you should be here. You should have all, like those people on the television commercials, you should have all become Italians or Germans or Poles. There's no reason why you should be here as Jews. What identity did you have as a Jew in a world where everybody else had a place and institutions and leaders and language? And what you did is float over all of that and say, yeah, but we're Jews. Now, that, by the way, you'll see in a moment, that puts you in a very weird position. Because you don't have a land, you don't have a government, you don't have institutions, and yet you cohere as a people. Who the hell are you? Yeah, but that's the point. You see, how did you get to be wandering Jews and not settled Poles or settled Italians?
Wandering Jew is used as a pejorative.
Yeah, no, I know that, but it's used as a pejorative, and part of the reason and you'll see that in a moment, part of the reason it becomes a pejorative is because you are unnatural. A people has a land. A people has a government. A people has institutions. A people has a place. You people have no place, and yet you're still a people. Haman says to Achashverosh, there is a certain people living in your land who are different from everybody else. Fear them. fear them. But he's not the one who invented that theory. That you're going to get in a minute in Pharaoh. Because who the hell are you? You understand that you defy all of the normal sociology. The normal sociology says that once you lose your identity as a polity, you should lose your identity and assimilate. But you didn't. You didn't. That's weird. So the first thing the Torah is going to do is say, okay, let's figure out who you are, who we are. Number one, we're family. Reuven, Shimon, Levi, Yehuda, Yisachar. We're family. We're connected to each other by blood ties. We're family. That's the first thing we are. But now, family has certain advantages and certain disadvantages. The advantage of identity as a family is, whatever you do, you're still family. Anybody here have a cousin they can't stand? Still your cousin. Sorry, can't fix it. He's going to get invited to the wedding, right? Or to the bar mitzvah, or to the, and he may even show up. Right? Who's that? My cousin. That's your cousin? Look, he's so, no, on my mom's side. Twice removed. Whatever you do, you're still family. Now, by the way, that's not a small thing. Because if there is a sense that whatever you do, you're still family, that means that there's something that binds us together. But we can have a pluralism of beliefs and practices. And I don't know if you know this, but Jews have a pluralism of beliefs and practices. Right? There are Jews who believe different things than we believe, than you believe, and practice very differently than you do, and yet we still identify them as ours. Right? Now, it's an interesting question. What are the boundaries? So that's an interesting question. How far outside of the accepted beliefs and practices can you be and still be part of the game? Right? Suppose you're an avowed member of another religious community, but you still consider yourself ethnically Jewish. There are such people. Right? I mean, it's a really interesting question. But the problem, there's a big problem with this identity statement. The big problem with identity as family, number one, is that nobody can enter. Because if you're not born in, you'll never be authentically one of us. If you're not born in, you're not part of the family. Right? You'll always be a son-in-law. Anybody here know what it's like to be a son-in-law, or worse, a daughter-in-law? Right? I mean, to be a daughter-in-law and your mother-in-law looks at you and says, so she calls me weeping. She calls me weeping and says, I'm the only one at the Seder table who can read the Haggadah in Hebrew. I'm the only one who actually owns a Bible. I'm the only one who can explain all the symbols on the Seder plate. But they won't consider me fully Jewish because I wasn't born into it and I can't make matzah balls. No, that's a very important thing. Matzah balls is one of the tropes, one of the symbols of identity. What? See, that's the problem. That's the problem with you Jews who are not really Jewish. You buy gefilte fish in a jar, and you tell me that the Jewish people isn't falling apart. My God. Shame on you. That's the problem. Yeah, but that's the dilemma of the daughter-in-law who's trying to get into the family, but is never going to be allowed in because the family is bound by a family tie. And even though she knows the practices and beliefs better than the resident, than those inside, she'll always be an outsider. That's the tragedy. That's the paradox of conversion to Judaism. You see, the paradox is you can't get in. You can't find your way in, right? Right? For the first 5 years of my marriage, I sat in the den and my in-laws are beautiful people, and they love me even more than they love their own kids, right? But I would sit in the den with my shoes on my feet, the feet on the floor, and I would say, "Excuse me, Mr. Bieber, sir, but may I have a glass of milk?" And after 5 years, Herb looked at me and said, "Stop this." He said something. He said, "Get your own goddamn glass of milk. You're in the family now. Go ahead." I said, "Yes, thank you, Mr. Bieber, sir." Take off your shoes, put your feet on the goddamn coffee table, and get your own glass of milk. I mean, that's when you're invited into the family, when you're allowed to take off your shoes and put your feet on the coffee table. No, it's a big deal. I said a bracha, But that's the first identity. Now, what happens is, so now the Torah is going to mess with that identity. We're not done yet. Ready? Joseph died and his brothers and all that generation. All right, so that's one identity, right? But the Israelites were fertile. Uvenei Yisrael, paru v'yishritzu v'yirbu v'yatzmu. Now, what you have to know about Exodus, about Shemot, is that Shemot knows Breshit. The guys who wrote Shemot, the guys who wrote this book, knew Genesis. And they're mimicking Genesis. They're consciously mimicking it. Genesis is the origins of the world. This is the origins of our story, of our people. So what happens in the beginning of the world? The world, these words, paru v'yishritzu v'yirbu, these are words that come from the animals that spread all over the world. We have this cosmic growth of population. V'yatzmu ba'od ma'od. We become incredibly powerful. V'timalei ha'aretz. These are all words from the first chapter of Genesis. If you want to go back and look at them. These are all words from the first chapter of Genesis. The writer of Shemot is winking at you. Yes, in the same way that God filled the world with life, God filled Egypt with Jews. Or at least it seemed that way. Vayakom melech hadash, a new king rises up. Asher lo yadat Yosef, who doesn't know our backstory. He wakes up one morning and he has Jews on his front lawn and he don't know how they got there. He doesn't know what we did for him and for Egypt. Or he doesn't want to know. Or he doesn't want to know. Or his political position is, right? His political position depends upon dividing his people up. That's a political strategy. We talked about a little bit of that last week. And now he's going to begin a strategy. Douglas, you want to ask a question?
Yeah, I was going to ask a question about.
Go ahead.
You're saying the use of Genesis and
Yeah.
Genesis terms. This Parsha is named Vaeira, and there was a Parsha, with
Vaeira, yeah.
Vaeira, same meaning, isn't it?
It's something, it's appearances, yeah.
Right.
Vaeira, God appeared to Avraham, and Vaeira is God is going to say to Moshe, here's how I appeared to your ancestors. Here's how they addressed me.
Is that the same concept?
We're going to get to that. Wait, we'll come back to that. This is the question of how does God self-disclose? This is not just about our identity, it's about God's identity. Look, if God wanted us out of Egypt really quick, he could have done it in 15 minutes. I mean, go, I mean, why not? Why have 10 plagues? Why not just start with the 10th? Right? They're just done. Why do you need 10 plagues? Because this is really a story about a developing identity of a people, a developing identity of God, and God's self-disclosure to the people. That's what this is going to be about. That's what's coming. So we're going to see in a moment how God self-discloses. Okay? Melech Hadash, right? And he says to his people, Hinei Am B'nei Yisrael. We said last time, this is the first time that we're called an Am. The first time that we're identified as an Am. And who is it who identifies us as Am B'nei Yisrael? A nation of the people of Israel? It's Pharaoh. So ironically, Pharaoh, who's going to be our nemesis, is an important character in the creation of an Israelite identity. You sort of have a foil, right? What is Israelite identity? Well, it's not Pharaoh. It's everything Pharaoh isn't. It's everything that Pharaoh isn't. And what is our goal in life? What is the goal of this national identity? It's to create a world which looks nothing like Egypt. One of the ways that you create identity is by creating these sort of oppositions, binaries. We are not Pharaoh, and Israel will not be Egypt. In fact, the whole Bible, in a certain way, is the opposition between the house of bondage and the promised land, between the place we're going and the place we came from. The place we came from is the worst place of darkness in the world. It's Egypt. The place we're going to is its exact opposite. Tell me about the place we're going to. Well, I can tell you this. It's everything that's the opposite of the place we came from. It's everything that's the opposite. Mitzrayim becomes the foil, the background for understanding where we're going on this journey. What happened in Mitzrayim? What happened in Egypt? The people, we were turned into objects. We were turned into slaves. It's a place where our humanity mattered nothing. mattered none. Where are we going? To a place where our humanity matters exquisitely, where our humanity is of infinite preciousness. That opposition of where you came from and where you're going, that's part of who we are. So Pharaoh becomes part of the story. And his identity is interesting, because we're going to learn about his identity. Who is Pharaoh? What kind of man is Pharaoh? Now, you all know what he looks like. He's Yul Brynner, right? He's the king and I, right? Yul Brynner is one of these wonderful actors. He's a great actor and apparently a wonderful humanitarian. And you know, but he played one role in all of his movies, right? I am the King of Siam, you know? First of all, I have a beautiful chest and I don't own an undershirt, you know? Because every time you see this beautiful chest, right? I am the King of Siam. I am, even in the Magnificent Seven, when he's riding around Arizona, I am still the King of Siam. I have a gun, but I am still the King of Siam, right? I mean, it's really, the truth is, like, you could never get that out of your head, right? Like, once Charlton Heston is Moses, you can never get that out of your head, right? They can shoot him to the Planet of the Apes, but he's Moses, Moses, you know? You come to liberate the monkeys is what he came to. I mean, really, these are actors that, so you get this sense, but really, I want you to try to scrub that from your head. It's really hard to do. But because really, you're going to see different aspects of this character. He's not as powerful as Yul Brynner, right? We'll see there's cracks in his character. Well, we'll see that as we get into it. He says to his people, the people of Israel are too numerous for us. Hava nitchakma lo. Nitchakma comes from the word chacham. Let's be wise about this. Let's be wise about this, right? Otherwise, they will rise up against us, you know, when they join our enemies and rise up against us. So this is the beginning of the politics of fear. And why can he practice that? Because they're an identified people. And what makes them so vulnerable to this? What has made us always vulnerable to this? We're different. And we don't abide by the laws of normal sociology. You have no land, and you're living among us, and yet you're not of us. You pretend, you look like us, you pretend to be like us, but really you're not. But then you insist on your distinction. You insist on your distinctiveness. Right? In fact, what's really, really perverse about you Jews is that whatever culture you've ever lived in, you've become more that than the natives. When you lived in Germany, you were more German than the Germans. When you lived in England, you were more English than the English. And now that you're in America, you're more American than the... You try so hard to be a native, and yet we know that you're not. We know that you're not. And you know that you're not. And that's terrifying. You don't belong. I mean, what are you doing here? Who are you? So you are easily identified and castigated. You're obviously the source of all of our tsuras. You really are. You're obviously the source of all of our problems, right? And once I can identify you and point at you and say you're the source of all of our problems, that means we're not. That means our problems are not the result of our own policies and decisions and values. They're your problem. And if I can point to you and say they're your problem, not ours, boy, that's a very powerful political instrument, you see? So here it is. Haman did it. Pharaoh did it. All through. Goebbels was the best. But he learned from the best. He learned from Pharaoh and from Haman. So they set taskmasters over them to oppress them with forced labor. Why do you put taskmasters over a people? What's the object of this policy? No, spy on them. You want to spy on them, you put spies in them. Control. First of all, you want to control their fertility. There's too many of them. So if we make you slaves, there won't be as many of you. But it's even more than just enslaving them for the purpose of limiting their numbers. It's enslaving them for the purpose of controlling them. If you really are the source of all of our problems, we have to figure out a way to control you. We have to figure out a technology to gain a sense of control over you, because otherwise you are yirbu v'yishritzu v'yatzmu. You're all over the damn place. You're like bugs, which was Goebbels' metaphor, remember? Right? But the more they oppressed them, the more they increased. God, you Jews, unbelievable. We put taskmasters over you and you breed like bunnies. Holy cow. That's really, what do we do about you? So now, and they came to dread them because, again, the laws of sociology don't apply to you. We oppressed you, and not only did you not lose your identity, not only did you limit your numbers, not only did the more we oppressed you, the less control we felt over you. You Jews. Because the more we oppressed you, the more you asserted your identity. That's what's so bizarre about you. You're supposed to give up your identity, guys. Right? I mean, the irony is if you'd gone the other way, they would have assimilated, right? If Hitler really wanted to do away with the Jews of Europe, all he had to do was go one more generation. There'd be no Jews left in Germany. Because the intermarriage rate in Germany was 75%. Right? One more generation, there'd be no Jews, but he was afraid of them. That's the problem. So the Egyptians ruthlessly imposed upon the Israelites the labors, and they ruthlessly made their life bitter for them with harsh labor at mortar and bricks and all sorts of tasks in the field. Before you turn the page, we had one identity structure, which was your family. Now we have a new identity structure. What's the second identity? We all have a common memory of having been slaves in the land of Egypt. A common memory of oppression. A common memory of oppression is a way of identifying a group of people. And then in a moment, you're going to get a common memory of liberation. Well, in 2 weeks, you're going to get a liberation story. That becomes a second identity. Now, what's the difference between identifying yourself as a family and identifying yourselves as the bearers of a story, as the tellers of a story? B'chol dor vador chayav adam lirot et atzmo kilu yatzav Mitzrayim. You tell the story in the first person. What makes you attached to this community is that you tell the story in the first person. Anybody can tell the story in the first person. How many of you have ancestors who really were in Plymouth, Massachusetts in 16, whatever that was, right? Mine were in, I don't know, where were our ancestors? In Russia or Romania or Italy or Germany or someplace, right? Minsk, there you go. There you go. No, seriously. But because, and when we came in 1914, but we don't sit at the Thanksgiving table saying our ancestors came to America in 1914 through Ellis Island. We say our ancestors came on the Mayflower to Plymouth Rock. You all say that, right? To become part of America, you tell that story in the first person. Everyone is admitted if you're willing to tell that story. Tell the story in the first person, you become one of us. So it admits a plurality of peoples who are willing to identify with our common experience. Then the question is going to be, how does that common experience inform the way you live in the world? Being a slave can do interesting things to you. How is that going to change us? We'll come to that a little bit later. Pop, you want to ask a question? No. Okay. All right. Sorry. All right. Make sure you want. I thought you did. Hang on.
It was the oppression that helped keep us together.
Well, some people think that, right?
I got news for you. If Gregory III would have accepted Jews, there wouldn't be any Jews today, or maybe an infinitesimal amount.
Well, that's the question. Had Jews been given freedom and open and welcome
accepted
and acceptance at any other point in history, would we have disappeared?
You know the story of the coat.
Go ahead.
A man was walking down the highway, and the wind and the sun got into an argument. And the wind said, I bet I can make him take it off. So the wind blew and blew and blew. And the harder he blew, the harder the man held onto the coat. Then the sun said, now let me try. The sun came out, shiny, but a beautiful day, a warm day, and the man took off his coat.
Wow. That sounds like a sermon that's going to be given one day at Valley Shalom. Thanks, Pop. Right, I mean, no, so the Midrash talks about, you know, if you boil an egg, it gets harder. You know, the more you boil it, the harder it gets. That's what Jews, that's why you have hard-boiled eggs on your Seder table. No, that's the reason. All right, now turn the page. Now we have a really interesting little excursus. I promise you we'll get to today's Torah portion. Maybe. But we have an excursus here. We have a little story that's snuck in here. The king of Egypt spoke to the midwives. Now, the Hebrew is really, we've talked about this before. The Hebrew is ambiguous. Are these Jewish women, Hebrew women, who are the midwives to other Hebrew women, so that the word Ivriot is an adjective? Or are these Egyptian women who perform the office of midwife to Hebrew women, so that the word Ivriot is construct form? Is it the midwives of the Hebrews or the midwives who are the Hebrews? You see the question? Rashi likes the midwives who are the Hebrews because he wants to make all the good guys in the story Jewish, right? Rabbi Shulweiss liked the other one because he liked Christian rescuers. You see, it's a different attitude. It's a moral attitude, okay? You can't tell from the context or the grammar here, okay? The king spoke to the Hebrew men. My professor, Moshe Greenberg, liked Rabbi Shulweiss's reading. Because Moshe Greenberg said it doesn't make any sense if they're Jews why they would cooperate with Pharaoh's genocidal dreams. Okay? It makes more sense if they're Egyptians. So Moshe Greenberg agreed with Rabbi Shulweiss. But Rashi liked it the other way. It's difficult to go against Rashi in the story. And you'll notice another thing, by the way, as we get into the story. All the heroes in the story are women. And all the villains are men. Which is why Harold Bloom said that it was written by a woman. Because the women are all going to be on the side of life, and the men are all going to be on the side of death. It's a very interesting opposition. The king of Egypt spoke to the Hebrew men, one of whom was named Shifra and the other Pua. Now what's interesting about that? What's the king's name? We don't know. So here's the guy who rules continents, and we don't know his name. The only name we know are the midwives' names. Isn't that interesting? Right? When you deliver the Hebrew women, look at the birth stool. If it's a boy, kill him. If it's a girl, let him live. Which shows you what he was really afraid of. It wasn't simply population increase. If you want to decrease a population, you kill the girls, not the boys. What you're worried about is an army. You're worried about a military threat. So you kill the men. The midwives, and I hear the Vatirena hamiyaldot eta Elohim. They feared God, but the word God here is not Adonai. It's not the personal God of the Jewish people. It's Elohim. It's the God of the world. It's nature God. They feared God. And they did not do as the king of Egypt told them. They let the boys live. So the king of Egypt summoned them. He brings them to the court, and he says, what the hell are you doing? I told you to kill the boys. Now what's the problem? The problem is that he's killing people. He'll kill them. So they have to come up with a way to get themselves out of it. So what do they say? Right? He says, why have you done this thing, letting the boys live? And the midwives said to Pharaoh, and this is a terrible translation, so we'll have to retranslate it. It says, because the Hebrew women are not like Egyptian women, it says they're vigorous. That's true too. But the Hebrew is much better, right? Ki lo kenashima mitzriota ivriot. They're not like us. Ki chayot hena. Anyone here have a grandmother who called you a vilda chaya? How do you say vilda chaya in Persian? I'm sure there's a word for it, right? A wild animal, right? Ki chayot hena. They're beasts. Now, why is that an important statement? Now, of course, Rashi says, he took it literally, he says they have 6 kids at a litter. That's not what it is. What are the Egyptians, what are the midwives doing? They're repeating, but what? They're repeating back to Pharaoh his own propaganda. Look, you told us they're not normal. My God, don't you know how it really happens? They don't have 1 baby, they have 12. And they do it, they're not pregnant, they just, bam, have baby. I mean, it's Pharaoh, it's unbelievable. Now, what is Pharaoh supposed to do? In public, he can't contradict his own propaganda. So what does he have to say? Okay. But so now it doesn't work. Before the midwives can come, they've given birth. God dealt well with the midwives, the people multiplied, and because the midwives feared God, he established households for them. Now, it didn't work. So if it didn't work, why is the story here? If it didn't work, if this was a failed attempt at limited genocide, why include the story? Why do you need this story? What does this story contribute? It doesn't contribute anything to the story of how we ended up as slaves in Egypt, but it does contribute something very important to the question of who are we? It does say something very important to the question of who are we? What does it say to that question? Brian, you got an answer? Throw the mic back here to Brian. Yo, I'm sorry, but we're just trying to keep everybody across the world informed. Yo. $900 microphone, just throw it at him.
No big deal. We have some pretty tough moms.
Yeah, we have tough moms. That's true. Right.
And the fact that we weren't, that our moms weren't afraid to fight back.
All right. So you get this notion of
threat.
The resistance comes from the female side of the population. That's true, and that's going to be throughout, because you're going to see in a moment the birth of Moses. His birth mother and his adopted mother are going to have the same issues. What else is being said here? Go ahead, Serge.
We are indestructible. We are tough.
I wish we were indestructible, but if
yeah,
you,
but in this sense, you're trying and you couldn't.
Yeah.
So it gives an.
Yeah, but yeah, okay, all right.
That's a little bit.
See, if we're indestructible, it's not a. You take away all the suspense and tension from the story. The suspense and the tension of the story comes from the fact that we don't know that we're indestructible, right? You don't know that. The fact that we don't quite know who we are yet, right? This is Superman growing up in Smallville. He's discovering who he is, right? But so why include this story in here? Well, what's characteristic about this story? You have two women who hang on a minute. We have you have two women who don't belong to our community. And what do? These two, take Rabbi Schulweis and Moshe Greenberg's reading. These are Egyptian women. These Egyptian women saved Jewish babies. Why is that an important part of our identity? What does it do for us? You want to pass the microphone? You see the question? Did everybody see the question?
So we're honoring and valuing righteousness.
Yeah. Where?
Shifra and Puya. We make them we establish a household for them.
So here's the point. You have no monopoly on righteousness. I don't know if you know this, but Jews sometimes get slightly self-righteous. Like, I don't know if you knew that. Sometimes a little chauvinistic. Sometimes a little, we're better than, and we even have a vocabulary for this. In fact, we have one of the most articulated vocabularies of our moral superiority to the rest of the world, right? We have words for them and words for us. In every language, Yiddish, Persian, Judeo-Persian, Judeo-Arabic, Ladino, there's an exquisite vocabulary for them and us. They are always morally degenerate and intellectually insufficient. Is that a nice way to put it? Yeah. And we are always somewhat superior. Right now, that vocabulary and that attitude comes from oppression. That is a defense against oppression. When I can't fight back in any other way, I tell jokes. Right? I can't fight back, so I make up fantasies about myself. I can't fight back, so I shake my head and talk about Goyish cup, right? The non-Jewish sensibility, right? But so the Torah comes along and says, no, don't do that. You're only here for one reason, because two Egyptian women understood a higher law of life and fought and risked everything to save you. You have no moral superiority. In fact, your job would be to go out in the world and find them. Because there is this interesting little note at the end, right? What did God do for them? What was their reward? Households. Now, what does households mean? They did not get new kitchens. I know that sounds nice, but what does bayit mean in biblical lore? It means, home. It means a dynasty. It means a line of descendants, which means who lives in the world with you? Shifra and Puah's descendants. They share the world with you. You are not alone. You are not the only ones who hear the law of life. You are not alone. Go find them. They fill the world too. Pharaoh's descendants also, by the way, but they fill the world too. Michael, go ahead.
Yeah, I think there are three elements going on here. First of all, with Shifra and Puah, excuse me, you have a forecast of what's going to happen at the end of the story when they leave Egypt.
Right.
Shifra and Puah are Egyptian midwives. They're given households. And in the very end of the story, many of the Egyptians join with the Hebrew nation, with the Jewish people, to leave.
Right.
They join with the so-called slaves to leave Egypt and become literally part of the Jewish people.
Right.
And I think that's a very, very, very important part of the story. The other two things are that the story itself is a predestination story. Don't worry, you are strong, and you will survive. That's one part of the story.
Yeah, that's Sergio's point.
Right.
Yeah.
And the other part of the story is that the idea of enslavement becomes the mythology by which you will live for generations to come, and as a result of that, you will have mercy.
That's the identity we're going to draw out of the experience of slavery. Because you could draw two very different identities out of slavery. You could draw an identity of moral callousness and moral isolation out of slavery. You can say, we hurt, nobody came to our rescue, to hell with them, I'm only going to take care of my own, and become very cruel. Or you can come out of slavery and say, I was a slave, I was redeemed, I have an obligation to redeem others. Right? And that question is going to go through the Bible. And that's going to go through all of Jewish history. How do you respond to oppression? What morality do you draw from your experience of oppression? Which is going to be the next story, if you just take a look at the next story. But I think Rabbi Gelman has something to say. I don't know why I think Rabbi Gelman has something to say. Go ahead.
Look, we're at this point in the story because we have to get Moses into the water.
Right.
We have to get him into the water because him being drawn out of the water presages the entire people being drawn out of the water at the crossing of the Red Sea, which gives you a triple level of connection back to Genesis and then Moses to the people.
Right.
It's all redoing the theme. But the ultimate goal of the Exodus is variously misstated as to leave Egypt. That's not the point. The point is to get to Sinai. It's not just to get out of Egypt. What's out of Egypt? The desert. The point of the Exodus is to get to Sinai. What's Sinai? Sinai is the other possible definition of who we are. The first is blood, which you said, and all of its difficulties, you said. We can see it, for example, today. You cannot become a Hindu, and because it's the largest religion in the world that defines itself by blood. However, there's a second way of defining what we are, and that is as a religion, which means a group of people who believe the same things about God and man and women. And that is a group that shares common beliefs. If you share common beliefs, anyone who shares those beliefs can join. Now, there are only two religions in the world this way, leaving out Buddhism, which is barely a religion. It's mostly a philosophy. And that is Islam and Christianity. We are the only religion in the world that has, for reasons that elude even me, we are the only religion in the world that tries to hold on to two conflicting notions of identity, blood and belief. Yeah, you're Jewish because your mother's Jewish, or maybe your father's Jewish if you paid temple dues, and which is the Reform view. And the other view is we're Jewish, the Maimonidean view, the one I endorse, which is that we're Jewish because we believe these things that are true about God and the world. And that's what God is trying to do. God is trying to create a religion out of a people who only define themselves by blood. And God fails in this because people want to be defined by blood. They want to be defined by a fact of their existence, not an attribute of their belief. And that's the great tragedy and the great dilemma that will be the dialectical engine driving on the Exodus.
Okay. What's the role of the narrative then? If I wanted to create a people that was defined by belief,
Yeah.
then I would have written Maimonides, not the Torah. I would have written a discursive philosophy that set it's Hilchos Deos. I would have written a discursive philosophy.
The Yigdal. He wrote the Yigdal.
Well, they wrote that from that. I would have written a discursive philosophy that takes me from premises to implications to, postulates, right? That's what I would have written. But I write a narrative. What's the role of the narrative then?
Well, as Childress and others who have explored the relation in philosophy between narrative and truth, the truth is that, particularly in ethics, the way the vector, the way we communicate ethical beliefs is through narratives. George Washington and I could not lie and I cut down the cherry tree.
Yeah.
And the idea is that the narrative is a bearer, like a cup. It bears ethical beliefs. So the Exodus bears the ethical belief of freedom. It bears the ethical belief you just wonderfully indicated, that our existence is the result of others who are not Jewish at all, which is refuting the idea of blood, that it wasn't blood at all. It was belief. It was, and as Harold discovered in the survivor, in the rescuers, that these were people who saved Jews because they would have been morally ashamed if they didn't do it. It was a belief, and the problem is, and this creates the dynamic that's tearing us apart internally, is that, and from converting people, as I do as well, people who convert to Judaism have in their heart a doubt that they will be accepted by those who believe that to be Jewish you had to be born to be into Jewish life, and without that, forget it.
Right.
Christians and Muslims accept people. If you say the Shahada in Islam,
right.
I believe that Allah is God, and Moses and that Muhammad is his prophet, you are a Muslim. That's it.
That's it.
And if you believe
you don't have to change your dishes.
Nothing.
Right.
Nothing. Well, there is an issue of pork and booze.
Yeah,
there is an issue of pork and booze.
But you don't need two sets of dishes. You try to come to a rabbi and say, I want to become Jewish now. Like, see how many things he makes you do, right?
Exactly.
It's amazing.
But we're trying to create a religion here.
Right.
And we're failing. We're failing. The narrative is simply the bearer of ethical beliefs.
Okay, I think
that's all it is.
So I'm gonna disagree with you.
Right.
I think that it's more than that.
Okay. What is it?
I think it has a status on its own, and I think the question that is left open is, what is the meaning of the narrative? Ma ze lachem, the kid asks at the Seder table.
Right.
What does this narrative mean? How does it inform your life? What are the conclusions you draw from it? Right? The reason why we maintain we're going to get back to the Parsha. The reason why you maintain a
I
blood,
doubt that, but who cares?
The reason why you maintain I care. The reason why you maintain a blood tie is because you want to leave room for a pluralism of beliefs, for an open, it's an ingenious system, because if you don't leave room for a pluralism of beliefs, you end up with 900 Protestant denominations, right? So what you end up with, what you have in Judaism is an ingenious system that allows for a pluralism, right, which gives us a great deal of flexibility when you face diaspora, because you can have people in the same community that have very different kinds of beliefs, but they're holding on to, number one, the blood tie, and number two, the narrative. And the beliefs then become part of our conversation. We have to figure out normative behaviors, but in terms of beliefs and basic categories of behavior, there's room for pluralism there. I want to go. I want to get to the Parsha today. So, today's Parsha, we're going to have to jump. Today's Parsha in order to understand today's Parsha, you got to go to page 340. So Moses comes to Pharaoh twice and says, let my people go. And Pharaoh says, if you have enough time to be fooling around with your dreams of freedom, you have enough time to do more work. So he gives them the task. He says, you have to gather your own straw. Remember, you're making bricks. So how do you make bricks? You gather mud, you mix it with straw, you let it bake, you get bricks. The straw was provided. The Israelites dug up the mud and did the mixing. Pharaoh says, you get up early in the morning, go get your own straw. So the foreman of the Israel, on page 340, verse 14, the foreman of the Israelites, whom Pharaoh's taskmasters set over them, were beaten. Why did you not complete the prescribed amount of bricks, as you did yesterday? And the foreman came to Pharaoh and said, why do you deal with your servants? No straw is issued. Make bricks. Your servants are beaten when the fault is with your own people. And he said, you're shirkers. You're shirkers. This is why you say, let us go and sacrifice. Be off now and do your work. So the foremen found themselves in trouble because Pharaoh was holding them to a quota and the people couldn't meet the quota. Right? You must not reduce the quantity of the bricks. And they left Pharaoh's presence, and they came upon Moses and Aaron standing in their path, and they said to them, may the Lord look upon you and punish you for making us loathsome to Pharaoh and his court, putting a sword in their hands to slay us. So what happened? This is the low point. In the drama, this is the low point. What's the low point? Everyone is against everybody else. Right? God says to Moses, go to Pharaoh and says, let my people go. So Moses didn't want to, but he did it. So he goes to Pharaoh and he says, let my people go. And Pharaoh doesn't listen to him. What does he do instead? He doubles the workload. So the people come to Moses and said, what did you do? You made our lives miserable. We told you, shut up. Don't make trouble. Be nice. Don't raise up your voice. It was bad as a slave. Now it's worse. This is what always happened to the person who's an agent of change. This is a complete characterization of anyone who ever tried to make change. In any organization, in any circumstance, what happens? The first step of making change is disruption, and that disruption is always worse than the status quo. Right? It's always worse than the status quo. And you go back to the person, why did you make it worse? So not only isn't Pharaoh listening, the people aren't listening, and Moses and Aaron now are completely isolated. Right? God sent them on this mission. Pharaoh won't listen to them. The people won't listen to them. So Moses gets so frustrated. Then Moses returns to God and he said, what the hell did you do this to me for? Well, sort of. Oh, Lord, why did you bring harm upon your people? It's much too literary. You got to, stutterer he may have been, but he's screaming, right? Why did you send me? Who needs this? Who needs this? Right? Martin Luther King finds himself in jail, and he writes a letter from the Birmingham jail. You can get it online, by the way. The whole thing's, it's brilliant. It's written to the ministers of Alabama, the black ministers, who told him, shh, still, be nice, don't make trouble. Ever since I came to Pharaoh to speak in your name, he's dealt worse with the people, and you still haven't delivered them. What are you doing? Right? And God says, wait, you're going to see what I'm going to do. You're going to see what I'm going to do. Right? He'll let you go. No one's listening to anybody. No one's listening to anybody. So the Hasidic tradition at this point says, this is the ultimate exile. The ultimate exile is the exile of language. When nobody listens to anybody, nobody believes anybody, nobody communicates with anybody. This is an exile of language. When we can't talk to each other, all we do is shout because no one can hear anybody. This is a breakdown of a complete breakdown of social solidarity. So now God says to Moses, let me tell you something. So turn to page 351, but don't lose this. We'll come back. 351. God says to Moshe, let me tell you who I am. You don't know me. Right? You don't know me. Let me tell you who I am. God spoke to Moshe. In the middle of this crisis, you got to get Moses' emotionality here, his pathos, right? In the middle of this crisis, God says to him, let me tell you something about me. I am the Lord. Ani Adonai. Yud He Vav He. The Lord, you see what's translated as the Lord? That's a bad translation. It's God's personal name, right? I am, Jehovah's, and that's horrible. It's Yud He Vav He, and we don't know how it's Hashem. That just means the name. But if you were able to pronounce the name, that's what you'd hear at this point. I am, right? I appeared to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob as El Shaddai. I did not make myself known to them by my name. And you can see that in the English, they print the Hebrew letters. Because the translator knows that he can't even put the Lord. He's going to put the name in there. In other words, what? When I appeared to your ancestors, it was different than when I'm appearing to you. I'm evolving. God is evolving. God has become... This is the self-disclosure of God. God is self-disclosure. God is discovering God's himself, and God is telling Moshe who he is. This is about identity, right? So the first identity is who's the people. We missed Moses' identity. I promise you we'll get that next week, the week after. The question is, who is God? I established my covenant with them to give them the land of Canaan, the land they lived as sojourners. I've heard the moaning of the Israelites because the Egyptians are holding them in bondage. I remembered my covenant. All right, so what do you know about this God? He forgets? And then he remembers. Remembers who? Who is my people? The Israelites. Who are they? Slaves. What kind of God is the God of slaves? Gods aren't gods of slaves. Slaves have no gods. The reason they became slaves is because their gods are weak. The gods of the masters are the real gods. Ask Friedrich Nietzsche. Right? Why would you want to be the god of slaves? This is a very strange thing. And not only is he a god of slaves, right? He cares. He's a God who cares. He's not this immovable, impassionate, stationary God. He's a God who cares. I've heard the moanings of the Israelites. I remembered my covenant. Say to the Israelite people, I am God, I am Adonai, I'm God. I'll free you from the labors of the Egyptians and deliver you from their bondage. I'll redeem you through extraordinary chastisements. How many verbs in that sentence? Say to them, I will what? I will free you. I will deliver you. I will redeem you. Right? And I will take you to my people, and I will be your God, and you'll know that I am the God who freed you from the labors of the Egyptians.
Those are the cups of wine.
Those are the cups of wine. See,
This is
go ahead.
in a sense, this is like making steel.
Yeah.
You cannot make steel without fire and burning. So therefore, going through slavery is the equivalence of that.
You're being, yeah, one of the images is that image. One of the images is the one the rabbi mentioned a moment ago, which is taking you out of the water, which is a birth image.
Right.
This is a forging image. Yes. You make something new by pushing it into something fire. It comes out stronger, comes out different. Yeah. I'm a God of change. Yud He Vav He is a verb, not a noun. Now, it's really weird to have a verb as your name. Yud He Vav He is a conflation of Haya, Hoveh, V'Hiyeh. It's a verb. I am a God of change. I am a God who lives in time. The social conditions that you confront today are not permanent and not stationary and not given and not inevitable. Not as long as I'm in the world. If I'm in the world, says God, then the social conditions are plastic. They'll change. They will modify. Who is a slave today will be free tomorrow. And who is Pharaoh today will be at the bottom of the Red Sea tomorrow. This is a revolutionary idea, that what you see is not what you get. Because there is a deeper reality behind what you see, and the reality behind what you see is moving the reality you see in a certain direction. It's just moving it in a way you can't see it yet. Just wait, you're going to see it happen. It's really hard to look at a society at a moment in history and see the change that is happening. It's much easier in retrospect. Right? What were the causes of the Civil War? In retrospect, we can tell, but James Buchanan had no idea. You can't see them at the time, but he's a God who says things are changing, and here's the direction they're changing. So what does it mean to embrace a God who's changing the social realities, a God who champions the cause of slaves, a God who says, I care. I care about you. Your job in life is not just to worship me. We have a reciprocity. I will redeem you. I will take care of you. I'm going to take care of you. This is a crazy revolutionary idea of God. A God who takes care. And then what are you going to need to do? How are you going to need to live your life to respond to the presence of such a God in the world? That's going to be the question that Mount Sinai is going to come to answer. So this is a question of identity. Who are we? Who is God? Who is Moses? Who is Pharaoh? What's happening here? It's all being disclosed. That's the nature of the narrative. Let's stop here. Wish everybody good Shabbos. Shabbat Shalom. So, you okay? You look sad.